Well, hey everyone, we are so excited to do this second part of this sermon series, which is really kind of a state of the church that I do each and every year, because I think it's good to circle back on what the ministry needs are and what our mission and vision is really all about. And so this series is called It's Personal, Helping the Next Generation Win. Last week we talked a bit about Todd Bolsinger's book, Canoeing the Mountains. And in that book, he likens the issues of the church in North America to Lewis and Clark and their 1803 Corps of Discovery that went to map out the area of the Louisiana Purchase. And they were looking for a navigable water route all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And their experience was, they were perfectly set up for this trip by canoe, and then they hit the Rocky Mountains. And the whole point is there was no way they were going to canoe the mountains. They had to do a course correct. They had to figure it out. If they were going to keep going forward and fulfill the mission, they had to figure out what that would look like. And they started by asking a question. I don't know. I don't know what we're going to need, but let's figure it out. And so like Lewis and Clark, the church in North America needs adaptive change. And adaptive change is not something that somebody can just teach you. Adaptive change is something that requires innovation. And it's clear that for the church in America, particularly when it comes to helping the next generation, we need to innovate. Why? Well, because we haven't done a good job with our generational handoffs. So here's some stats that we talked about last time, just by way of reminder in case you missed last week. And this is all the bad news, right? We get to the hope as we go, but this is all the bad news, that in the United States, 4,000 churches close their doors every single year, and 2.7 million people fall to inactivity. They were once active members, they become inactive every single year. And the average church size in America, and this includes the largest churches in America, is 75. And the reason why I say it includes the largest churches is think about what that number would be without megachurches, which is only about 1,600 churches in America. 75. If you just look at our own denomination, you see the same loss. PCUSA, over the last 5 years, we've lost 345,000 members, roughly 20% in 5 years. And it's even worse for attenders, right? Because there's a difference between being a member and being a regular attender. But even for attenders, 183,000 we lost in 5 years, or 25%. And we lost a total of 1,000 congregations. Now, if you break this down by what's happening in culture, of course, we know why. It's because the gravitational pull, it used to be toward church, and now it's away from church, and it has been for decades. In fact, this really shows up in this Barna infographic, where it looks at the percentage of people with a biblical worldview by generation. It shows how it declines the younger you go. So for example, the baby boomers, my parents' generation, roughly 10% of them say that they have a biblical worldview. By the way, that's what an incredibly low number that is, but 10%. But then you go to my generation, Generation X, and it's 7%. That's the largest jump in between from one generation to the next. And then the generation after me, the millennials, 6%, not a huge drop. But then the generation after them, my kids' generation, Generation Z, 4% would say that they have a biblical worldview. The gravitational pull is away from church. And this is the stat that I said last week, and this is the one that scares me the most, to be honest. This is the one that we call this series It's Personal. This is the one that I feel the most personally invested in. And that is teens 13 to 18 years old are twice as likely as adults to say that they are atheist. Also from Barna's research. Twice as likely. You feel like we've gotten it wrong when it comes to our kids. We care a lot about some things, and some other things, maybe even the things that matter most. Generationally, at least, we've dropped the ball. It reminds me of Judges 2:10. I was thinking about this a lot. Judges 2:10 says, after that whole generation had been gathered to their ancestors, another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. And I got to tell you, even as a pastor, I feel the struggle of handing down my faith to my kids just simply because of time. It used to be that everybody had time in their house, right? Kids had time to be around the table. Kids had more time at home. And now we're all scattered, it's divide and conquer, and we're going off to baseball, and we're going off to dance, and we're doing all these different things. And, hopefully we meet somewhere in there to spend some time together. It's tough, but we got to do better. We got to find a way to reconnect this generation with the goodness of God. This goodness that we've seen in our own hearts and lives. This goodness that has driven our lives for most of them. For most of us, our faith has driven our lives, or at least it's starting to now. So how do we do better? How do we, like Nehemiah from our story last week, how do we, like Nehemiah, how do we figure out what we're going to do about it? It's one thing just to be sad. In Nehemiah's story, he starts out where he's sad and he's weeping over what happened to Jerusalem. But it doesn't end there. It ends with action. What are we going to do about it? And so last week I left you with this question. What will I personally do to help the next generation win? What will I personally do? Because it is personal. We're talking about faith. We're talking about our kids and grandkids. We're talking about giving them the thing that matters more than youth sports or education or any of the other things that are also important. And that's a relationship with Jesus Christ. Well, maybe a way of approaching this is to go back a little bit. I often like to talk about Pastor Robert Schuller, who was the pastor of the Crystal Cathedral. I like it because he was one of the most innovative pastors of our time. A lot of people don't give him credit for this, but what he saw was that church as society knew it, even back in the 1960s, wasn't reaching everybody. They had to think of some new ways to reach people where they are. And so what he did was he started having church in a drive-in movie theater. And I've told this story before because I think it's great. Drive-in movie theater. People will come in, they put the little speaker thing on the window. And my goodness, if you're under 25, you may not even know what I'm talking about. But a drive-in movie theater where you drive up your car, you put the speaker there, and you watch the screen, basically, in a parking lot. Well, they started doing church that way. And they used to bring in an organ every week to the drive-in theater. They put it on top of the roof of the concession stand. And they would play the organ in order to do the hymns. It was wild. But he had this philosophy that I think makes complete sense for us today. And that was this. He was asked, what's the success to reaching people where they are? What's the success of ministry to younger generations? And he said, find a need and fill it. Find a hurt and heal it. Find a problem and solve it. And that's, I think, exactly what we're called to do for this next generation. How do we get to know them? How do we know what their pain points are? How do we know what their needs are? So that we can have a shot at meeting them. I want you to consider this question today. This is a great question. This will bring up a whole bunch of different memories. In what ways is life different for kids today than when you were growing up? I mean, think about it. Think about how many things have changed. I was reflecting on this and thinking, man, my kids don't even know about what it used to be like to get up and turn the dial on the television. Right? They don't even know that whole thing. Or that summers were kind of like this wonderful wasted time that I feel like even our summers now aren't the same. It felt safer back then. I don't know if it was, but it felt safer. The world felt safer. The world, even though we're in the middle of the Cold War, and we used to have, oh my gosh, if you remember those movies, those after-school specials, the one that they did called The Day After, it's called The Day After, I think, about the nuclear holocaust. And I remember my family sitting around there and watching this show and being absolutely terrified that we're going to have nuclear war. And yet, at the same time, I felt it was safer. There weren't domestic terrorism in the way that we've seen. There's school shootings. It was just different. It was a time when you could go to the airport and see loved ones off at the gate. It was a different time. And I think about the difference of what our kids are dealing with now, especially too, of course, when you think about technology, security, having close friends and family around. If you're looking for some resources on this next generation, I want to point you to a few that I love. The first is, and I've mentioned this before, is Generation IY by Tim Elmore. This is a standard when it's talking about the next generation. Also, this other book that came out in the last year called Growing Young by Kara Powell, Brad Griffin, and Jim Mulaney. And this book was awesome. These are Fuller Seminary folks, and they did this study of 250 congregations and of young people and young people of faith, and they were asking them a lot of questions about what their needs are. And so this book gives you 6 essential strategies. This is a great book if you want to know more about it. But let's get into it. Let's get to know Generation Z a little bit. And the first thing that we notice, if you see the cartoon here, is Generation Z, they are digital in their DNA. They are digital natives. For me, when I first got an iPhone, it was like an outer space experience. It was totally foreign to me, and I had to figure out how it worked. For my kids, it's like they already came with the software inside of them. They figure it out instantly. There's no fear of the screen. It's just part of their life. It's part of their way. And I think this cartoon's hilarious. It's like, how's your day, honey? You could read about it on my blog, Dad. It's just a whole different age. And so that's the first thing that we notice about Generation Z. This is our youth generation, 18 and under, is that they're digital in their DNA. They've called them the 5 screens generation, that they could be on 5 different screens at once and still be able to pay attention, which, if it were me, there's no way. I could barely focus on you right now. But, think about it. They could be on their TV, their tablet, their phone, their watch, their computer, 5 different screens, and they could still be able to get their homework done, which is something that my wife and I struggle with our kids doing homework. But they can do it. They are digital natives. The second thing is, closely related, is that they're incredibly image and video driven. In fact, that's how they learn best. And think about how much that has drastically changed just the education model, but the education model in the church, Sunday school. They're visual learners more than ever. And if we do like an old school Sunday school program for them, they're not going to get as much out of it, because that's not the way that they learn even in their regular school anymore. This other book from Jeff Fromm and Angie Reed called Marketing to Gen Z it's a secular book. It's not from the church world, but they talking about, how do we market to the next generation? Is that what they discovered for marketing is that their content has to be authentic, right? Because these kids smell fake instantly. Authentic, it has to be fast. They say that they only have 8 seconds to grab a kid's attention. 8 seconds. Their messaging has to be seamless and consistent. Like, it has to make sense as a brand. It has to be friendly, human, humorous, compassionate, and secure. Now think about what that means for our messaging to kids. We better make sure that our messaging follows these same guidelines if we're going to reach the next generation. The third thing is they are future focused. In fact, they're saying that this generation is more optimistic about their future than the previous generation. And number 4 kind of goes with it. They're both traditional and nonconformist. So it's interesting. They are, if you want to use the terms liberal and conservative, they're both. On both ends of the spectrum. They're sort of all over the place. But they have more in common values-wise with their grandparents, which is really interesting. And then the 5th part is that they absolutely crave community. Now, we know this, of course, through social media phenomenon, but they really crave physical community, even though they might not even realize it. So in Marketing to Gen Z, I love this quote from the book. It affirms that whole thing about getting real. It says, Gen Z is communicating faster than you can plan, learning faster than you can teach, and consuming faster than you can create. So take a deep breath and stop trying to get it perfect. Instead, just get real. The most important thing is not to worry about if we're up on the latest app that came out or if we're up on the latest piece of technology that they're using, but rather, are we being real? Are we being authentic in who we are and who they are and who Jesus Christ is and why does he matter to them? In that book, Growing Young, they researched 250 congregations and 1,300 young churchgoers between 15 and 29, so a little bit older than our age group we're talking about. But the thing is, number one thing they wanted is they craved authentic connection. In fact, this is a quote from the book that I love. Warm is the new cool. Warm is the new cool. And for a lot of people it became, it's about we made church cool. And what they're saying for this generation is, yeah, you have to have the technology because they expect it. They have technology everywhere in their lives. But that's not what draws them in. That's not the thing that wows them. What really draws them in and gets them to stay and become a part, an engaged person in your community, is your warmth, is your authenticity. Warm is the new cool. And that's why I think churches are perfectly poised to reach the next generation. This is from Mark chapter 10, beginning in verse 13. People were bringing little children to Jesus for him to place his hands on them, but the disciples rebuked them. When Jesus saw this, he was indignant. He said to them, "Let the little children come to me and do not hinder them, for the kingdom of God belongs to such as these. Truly, I tell you, anyone who will not receive the kingdom of God like a little child will never enter it." And he took the children in his arms, placed his hands on them, and blessed them. I find that short story of Jesus and children to be absolutely compelling. First of all, we might get the sense that, well, the next generation is a bit of an afterthought. First, I take care of my needs, my wants and desires, and then it will kind of trickle down to the kids. And then we'll do something for the kids. Let me give you a practical example of how this works. In some churches, right, it's like, well, we have a great kids ministry. It's so great that we put them in a garage out in the back of the property. Right? Like, we're not going to give them the prime real estate in the church because they're kids, right? We get the prime real estate. Churches need to drastically rethink our priorities when it comes to the next generation. We need to make a statement that, we care about our environments for kids. We think they're just as important, if not more important, than our environments for adults. We need to invest in our programs, in our staffing. We need to invest in this next generation in a meaningful way, not just as an afterthought. And so as we dial in to maybe what's a course of action, these are the things that we're thinking about as a church, as we're moving on to this next year, this next program year, this next fiscal year. That we've invested more, as you'll see in our budget if you come to the congregational meeting, we've invested more in our next gen ministries. And we think that's the way it should be. We also we're experiencing growth as a church. As I said, it's been an exciting time. We're actually growing. Despite all the numbers in our denomination and in churches in America, we are way above the average, and that is God's blessing on us. God's given us a wave to ride, and so we better ride it. So what are some practical applications of how we can help the next generation win? If we get to know this generation and know what their needs are, we know that they want warmth, we know that we only have a little time to capture their attention, we know the challenges in front of them, what are some of the ways forward? Here's a couple. The first is we need to keep speaking the language of culture. That's why our Sunday school and our youth groups are all geared to speaking the words of truth into their language. It was the first gift of the Holy Spirit to the church, was to translate into other languages, translate the wonders of God into the languages of the people. We need to keep doing that, especially to our next generation. The second is we need to give them interpretation, not just information. Information isn't what's needed. What's needed is transformation. What's needed is interpretation so that they can decide to follow Jesus. That's really important, really important. And so you'll see in our Sunday schools, we spend a lot of time with personal relationship with them. It's not that we don't give them information, but it's not just about kind of memorizing a bunch of propositional truths about Jesus. It's about getting to know Jesus personally. And then the third thing is we need to give them handwritten attention in a smartphone world. We need to love these kids, and we need to show it. We need to spend time with them. We need to engage in their lives. We need to have shared experiences of them, of church, of ministry, of serving. How great would it be to take your kids or grandkids to a service opportunity, or to invite somebody to come to worship on a Sunday, or to simply worship together intergenerationally. We need to give them handwritten attention, because honestly, they're not getting it anywhere else. Everything is sort of a list of emails or texts or Instagram direct messages. We need to give them that personal connection. You know, like when you get a letter from someone, it's different. It's just different. It's got a level of care about it that's completely different than getting any other kind of communication. That's what we need to share with our next generation so that the warmth comes across. Because here's the thing. It is personal. I want to share with you something that we're doing now that's going to be an opportunity that you may want to get in on. I want you to consider joining us in our vision for this next year. What we need for Sunday school is we need more small group leaders. We switched the whole model of having a bunch of teachers to having a couple of teachers and some small group leaders who are basically going to shepherd the kids week after week. Why? Because it's personal. Because we want them to develop relationships. We want them to feel the warmth. If warmth is the new cool, we want them to experience warm. And we think it's in the context of that experience and that shared relationship that they're going to best grow closer in their relationship with Jesus Christ. But we need more people. As this program continues to expand, we just can't have the same finite number of people with these kids. We need more. And so today, you're going to have an opportunity when you go out into the lobby where you came in. There's some folks from our Next Gen ministry to talk to about becoming a small group leader. Now, it's an application process, and they may decide that you may or may not fit in what they're doing, or they may have a certain demographic and they're looking for more of another demographic. Don't be offended if that happens. But we need you to put your hand up and say yes. We need people to come out and to prayerfully see if this is a ministry for them. Because if you aren't up for the small group leader, and if you feel like it's not a fit, then you need to figure out what is your fit going to be. What are you going to personally do to help the next generation win? All right, thanks everyone, and let's keep moving forward. Let's make a difference. We've gained some ground, but we're not there yet. Let's not stop until the mission of Jesus Christ is fulfilled. Amen.